so I didn't want to move anything. So we'll make it work. We're all tough people. We'll be good to go. So we cover heavy hitters tonight, where we go causes of the Civil War, and then Civil War, Gilded Age, and then, Reconstruction, Gilded Age, and then we finish with imperialism. So there is kind of what our menu is, or what our flight plan is, for those of you who are future pilots. Now, the first 4 chapters, we're going to handle like 2 chapters. So we're going to do 1819, we're going to do 2021, because 1819 is causes to the Civil War, and 2021 is the Civil War, okay? And we know what we need to know about wars, causes and consequences. One of the things that I am doing, and you'll get it next Tuesday, is creating a 1 slide per war causes and consequences sheet for you to study from. So there is that. So again, we start with causes of the Civil War, 1890. Civil War itself, 20 and 21, 1819, excuse me. Civil War itself, Reconstruction, Gilded Age, and then we'll end with imperialism. So that is our flight plan as to where we are going to go on this fine evening. So if the old packet will finish and the new one will begin, if I could ask Liliana to start us off, and for time's sake, I'll probably just call on readers tonight with chapter 18, the chapter summary, please. For those of you who haven't been to one of these yet, and most are familiar faces, but if you haven't, we read the chapter summary of each chapter. This is published by the American Pageant. They do a 1-page summary. Then I sort of go over some things. I ask you some questions, and we look at the key terms, and then we move along. So, Liliana, if you would please, chapter summary of chapter 18.
The acquisition of territory from Mexico created acute dilemmas concerning the expansion of slavery, especially for the 2 major political parties which had long tried to avoid the issue. The anti-slavery Free Soil Party pushed the issue into the election of 1848. The application of gold-rich California for admission to the Union forced the controversy into the Senate, which engaged in stormy debates over slavery and the Union. After the timely death of President Taylor, who had blocked dissettlement, Congress resolved the crisis by passing the delicate Compromise of 1850. The compromise eased sectional tension for the moment, although the fugitive slave law aroused opposition in the North. As the Whig Party died, the Democratic Pierce administration became the tool of pro-slavery expansionists. Controversies over Nicaragua, Cuba, and the Gadsden Purchase showed that the expansionism was closely linked to the slavery issue. The desire for a northern railroad route led Stephen Douglas to ram the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress in 1854. By repealing the Missouri Compromise and making new territories subject to popular sovereignty on slavery, this act aroused the fury of the North, sparked the rise of the Republican Party, and set the stage for the Civil War.
And I'm just going to move to Natalia's left. Move to 19, please, because we're going to do these 2 together. So, excuse me, move to Liliana's left. Natalia, would you take 19, please?
The 1850s were punctuated by successive confrontations that deepened sectional hostility until it broke out into the Civil War. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin fanned northern anti-slavery feeling. Kansas pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces fought a bloody little preview of the Civil War. Buchanan's support of the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution alienated moderate northern Democrats such as Douglas, Congressman Brooks, beating of Senator Sumner, arousing passions in both sections. The 1856 election signaled the rise of the sectionally based Republican Party. The Dred Scott case delighted the South, while Northern Republicans plunged in defiance. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 deepened the national controversy over slavery. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry made him a heroic martyr in the North, but caused outraged Southerners fiercely irate. The Democratic Party split along sectional lines, allowing Lincoln to win the 4-way 1860 election. 7 Southern states quickly seceded and organized the Confederacies in America. As Southerners optimistically cast off their ties to the hated North, Lincoln President Buchanan proved unable to act. The last-minute pretended compromise effort failed to cement his opposition.
As many of you noticed in the back here, I have the handy-dandy causes to the Civil War, all in 13 steps. So I'll go through them with you, okay? So, really, this starts with the Wilmot Proviso. Reminder, Wilmot Proviso is the addition said that any territory gained from the Mexican cession should have no slavery. Does that bill ever actually become law? The will not proviso was attached to it. Does that bill ever become law? It does not, right? But it puts slavery on the tongues of everyone. And then what gets discovered in California in 1848? Gold. So the 1848 California gold rush is sort of your contextualization, along with the Mexican-American War, for the causes of the Civil War. Because California has such a population rush that by 1849, it's ready to enter as a free state. What's the problem with California entering as a free state? No slave state twin. So Henry Clay comes up with yet another compromise, his third and final, the Compromise of 1850. And it has 5 parts, but there's 3 major parts. In the Compromise of 1850, California is allowed to enter as a free state, favoring the North. There is no slave state twin, so my question is, what does the South get? They get something, and the thinking was that what they get would be legitimate for them. What do they get? Go for it, Anna.
Don't they get a railroad?
Well, that's the plan, but it doesn't come quite yet. So I'm looking for what else, what do they get? It has to do, go for it, Dave.
Just a fugitive slave law?
A stricter fugitive slave law. Now, instead of slaves who are escaping on the Underground Railroad having to get to the north, like Ohio or Michigan, where's the only safe place for slaves that are escaping? Gotta go camp, gotta go out of the country, right? But here's the problem with this stricter fugitive slave law. It backfires on the South. Why does this fugitive slave law backfire on the South? What happens? That's right. Why? Because does this personalize slavery for a lot of Northerners? Okay? You might remember the name Anthony Burns, who's a great example of this. If you don't, no big deal, but I'll kind of remind you. Anthony Burns was a person who was born into slavery in Virginia, made his way to Boston, worked in a fancy clothing store, and at said fancy clothing store, he got to know Boston's elite. Okay? But he gets arrested in 1854 and sent back south. So that personalizes slavery, and there are Anthony Burnses all throughout the North. So this fugitive slave law will actually increase the abolition movement. It backfires on the South. Big time. Okay? So it says, fugitive slave law, which backfires on the South. California enters as a free state. And then popular sovereignty is allowed in the new territories of Utah and New Mexico. Well, it seems like that would be pro-Southern, but why is that not pro-Southern? What happened? Go for it, Daniel.
It's all desert.
Can't grow a damn thing there. So slavery never takes off there because it doesn't work. So even though the Compromise of 1850 was designed to be a very fair document to both the North and the South, what region did it favor, the North or the South?
North.
The North. It is a very pro-Northern document. However, it does, for a very short time, 2 years, calm the slavery tensions down for only 2 years. We'll get to why in a minute. 2 years go by and Henry Clay dies. With him, what political party will die in 1852? The Whigs. So you're done with the second two-party system. To remind you, from either last time or maybe just your own knowledge, the Whig Party was a reaction. It started because of a hatred of one person. Who did the Whigs hate? Andrew Jackson. And Jackson's party was called the what?
The Democrats.
They were the Democrats, right? So Democrats and Whigs were the second two-party system. The first two-party system, remember, was Hamilton v. Jefferson. What were their political parties? Federalists and JDR. Also in 1852, I wrote down Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I'm going to circle it a couple of times because I cannot overstate its importance. First of all, what is Uncle Tom's Cabin? It's a what? It's a book. Is it a book of, technically, is it a book of fact or is it a book of fiction?
Fiction.
It's technically a fiction book, right? It's a fiction book about Uncle Tom, who was a slave, who was super nice and kind, and his harsh slave master, Simon Legree. the author, a woman. Anybody remember her name? Go for it, Anna. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe is the daughter of the Reverend Lyman Beecher, who was a preacher during the Second Great Awakening. She is the sister of Catherine Beecher, who was part of the movement to make women teachers, single women teachers at the time. How much exposure to slavery did Harriet Beecher Stowe have? Had she ever seen it firsthand, her life? No. She was from Connecticut, lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, had never seen it. What does the South do to Uncle Tom's Cabin? They ban it. They don't even allow it. It's a bestseller in the North. Where else is it a bestseller? What other country? Go for it, Daniel. England. Well done. Good work. So, Uncle Tom's Cabin will calm any goodness that came from the Compromise of 1850. For a very short time, people thought, okay, the Compromise of 1850, maybe we solved slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin blows the doors off of it. Now, I want to go back to what Anna said. Don't they get a railroad? In 1853, the Gadsden Purchase is a small piece of land, and you did this map way back in December. Anybody remember where the Gadsden Purchase was located? Where was it at? Go for it, Anastasia. Yeah, well, pretty close to there. It's extreme southern New Mexico and Arizona. It is bought for way too much money, but it's bought because they're going to build a railroad from Houston to Los Angeles. It's going to be the southern route. And that's the plan, and it makes the most sense because that's flat land. You don't have to go through the Rocky Mountains. All of that land was organized, and the mileage was actually shorter. Until, now you want the 5 on the AP test answer. There's one guy, the little giant, 5'3.5" tall, and a fairly rotund 200 and some pounds. So a fairly little, kind of looked like I don't even know, a railroad operator stereotype maybe. He said, excuse me, we're not going to build that railroad in the South. Who am I thinking of?
Stephen Douglas.
Stephen A. Douglas, who is a senator from Illinois. What city does he want to become the transportation capital? What is it? Chicago. Good job. He said, and he sees the writing on the wall. If this railroad's built through the South, Chicago cannot become the transportation center. So he says, I have an idea. We're going to organize Kansas and Nebraska. We're going to build the railroad through Nebraska, which is what would happen for the first transcontinental railroad. And we're going to allow popular sovereignty in both of these areas. Uh-oh. What does that mean? Popular sovereignty, first of all, means let the who decide. People. In Nebraska, it sort of becomes very clear. Nebraska is an area where you can grow grain and corn. It wasn't really attractive to slavery, but Kansas had enough areas that attracted slave owners. Are there free soilers and slave owners who both settle in Kansas? Do they both settle there? Yes. Do they get along when they're in Kansas? No. So what will happen is this will overturn the Missouri Compromise. Now, the Missouri Compromise at this point had been law for 34 years, since 1820. It was a flawed law, but it was still something that Americans held on to. 34 years is a long time, right? So the Compromise of 1850 challenged the Missouri Compromise. Now it's overturned completely. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is one of the worst laws Congress has ever passed. The only good that comes out of it is it leads directly to the formation of a new political party that rallied around the idea of no slavery in the territories. What new political party am I thinking of here? Republican. Make a note, because it's a very easy error for students to make. The Republican Party did not say no slavery. They knew better. Would they have any support if they said no slavery at all in the 1850s? They wouldn't have. But they said no slavery in the territories. Here is your third two-party system. Now you've got Republicans be Democrats. Okay? So the second two-party system, Whigs and Democrats. Third two-party system, Republicans and Democrats. And the Republican Party is special because it's the first political party that there's a region that has zero support. And what region is that? The South. Is there any Southerner that's going to be attracted to the Republican Party? No way, right? So, From this Kansas-Nebraska Act, 2 years later, Senator Charles Sumner, abolitionist from Massachusetts, rises in the Senate in May of 1856, and he gives a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. And this speech is scathing. It said that anyone who was a pro-slaveryite in Kansas, he insults. He insults the Kansas-Nebraska Act himself, or itself. He insults Stephen A. Douglas. He insults a man named Andrew Butler, who was a senator from South Carolina, who was the co-author with Douglas of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, Charles Sumner is from the abolitionist hotbed of Massachusetts. That's where Anthony Burns had been arrested and sent back. It's where William Lloyd Garrison published his paper, The Liberator. And Preston Brooks reads the next day the speech of Charles Sumner in the newspaper. And Preston Brooks is from South Carolina, and he takes it personal. He was a friend of Andrew Butler, and he couldn't believe that this guy, a senator, a respected elected official, would be so insulting. And I think you know the story. What does Preston Brooks, the day after that, do to Charles Sumner? Go for it, Lorela.
Hits him with a cane.
Whoops him. And he whoops him with a cane to the point that, I mean, we're talking at least, by all accounts, 20 times. Charles Sumner had to be dragged out of the Senate with a stretcher. He doesn't recover from his injuries for 2.5 years. What does it prove? That not only have sectional tensions meaning regional, north v. south, become so severe that they now had caused violence on the Senate floor, right? The next year, 1857, in my opinion, the worst Supreme Court case in all of American history, tied with Plessy, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was a slave. He had been taken into free territory by the family that owned him, the Sanford family. Lived in Illinois, lived in Wisconsin. After the original owner died, he sued for his freedom. Sanford family wanted to keep him. Slaves were property, slaves were big money. Goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Who does the court side with? Dred Scott the slave or the Sanford family? The Sanford family, and it's a bombshell. What region is going to support the Dred Scott decision? The South. What region is going to abhor and hate the Dred Scott decision? So there's 3 parts to the case. First of all, the Supreme Court says, wait a minute, you're a slave. And under chattel slavery, slaves are considered what? Property. So you have no right to be in court. So first he throws the case out, the court does. But then the court goes further. And they say, furthermore, because of chattel slavery, slaves are property, and where in this country can you take your property? They can go where? Anywhere. And furthermore, if slaves can go anywhere, then the Missouri Compromise was never constitutional in the first place. The South celebrates, they say finally, the North can't believe it. Abolitionists rise to the occasion, so this will increase the abolitionist movement. Meanwhile, the South finally says, listen, leave us alone. Okay, the court has ruled, you're done. Okay? The same year, there is a panic of 1857. Okay, same reasons as always, overspeculation in land and railroads, but this one's special. What region is immune from the panic of 1857? Why? What happened to cotton prices? Did they ever get lower during this time? And the Southern economy is a one-trick pony, leading directly to the Cotton is King speech. James Henry Hammond, Senator, South Carolina, early 1858, says, you dare not wage war on cotton. No place on earth should wage war on it. Cotton is what? And what's the point of the Cotton is King speech? By this point, did the South really feel that they could be their own separate nation and be okay? That's what the Cotton is King speech said, right? Same year, Stephen A. Douglas, same guy from the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is up for re-election in the Senate. He's the Democratic candidate. He wants to get re-elected. A little-known challenger from the Republican Party, this new upstart party, challenges him for his seat. That is Abraham Lincoln. And they have a series of 7 debates around Illinois. Now, let's be very careful because students get this confused. Is Douglas re-elected in 1858 to his Senate seat? Yes, he is. Okay? Douglas wins the battle, but Abraham Lincoln becomes a Republican star and puts him on the map. And oh, by the way, who's the Republican candidate in the election of 1860? Abraham Lincoln. Does he win the election? How many southern states does he carry? Uh-oh. How could he possibly win with no southern states? How does that happen in 1860? Go for it, Jamie.
There's a higher population in the north.
There you go. The northern states' population carried the day and gave him the majority. By the time Lincoln takes office, 7 states had seceded. The sitting president, James Buchanan, the outgoing president, what did he do when these states seceded, by the way? Where's he ranked as the president? He's dead last, and he always will be. Could he have done something? You're the commander-in-chief of the military. Now, that leads me to, if you're the South, the 3 strikes and you're out theory. If you talked to a Southerner in 1860, of course it's about slavery, sure. But here's what they'd say. It's a logic problem. In 1819, the South lost the House. Because by 1819, the North had a higher population than the South did, even with the 3/5 compromise. In 1850, the South lost the Senate because California came in as a free state with no slave state twin. And in 1860, the South lost the presidency because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. He stood for no slavery in the territories, and we can't support that. And you have, shortly after Lincoln takes office, Fort Sumter, which, as we know, begins the what? Fort Sumter's the first battle of the Civil War, right? Okay, I'll give you a minute to catch up here. We'll move on to 20 and 21. Obviously, at the break, you can take pictures of that. Here's your one-stop shopping of causes to the Civil War. If you get a prompt about sectional tensions, this is what they mean. Sections of the country, North and South, occasionally the West, but almost always North and South. That's what that vocabulary means. Just like continuity means things staying the same. Okay? All right, good. 2 chapters down. We'll reconvene. I'll come to the back there so we can stay there. I'm just getting my stuff. It only makes sense.
What are the key words for the chapter?
Let's take a look. Good questions. Let's look at the key words and make sure that we've covered them on 18 and 19. Popular sovereignty we talked about. If you see Free Soil Party, the Free Soil Party was a very short-lived party that said no slavery in the territories. The Republican Party will copy that. Okay? John C. Calhoun, if you see that name, he's from South Carolina. He stood for states' rights. The idea that states should nullify federal laws. Compromise of 1850 we talked about. You do not need to know Franklin Pierce. End of the Whig Party is when who dies, by the way? Henry Clay. Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad. The point of the Underground Railroad is after the Fugitive Slave Law, where did the Underground Railroad have to make sure the runaway slaves went? Go to Canada, right? Good. Gadsden Purchase we talked about. Stephen A. Douglas, Kansas-Nebraska Act. Transcontinental Railroad is why the Gadsden Purchase happened and why Stephen A. Douglas gets the Kansas-Nebraska Act back. This was going to be the southern route. He wanted a northern route. Why was the Transcontinental Railroad, why did it have to be built so damn quickly? What did you have to connect immediately to the country? California. It's rich with gold, and there's a real worry there that perhaps if we don't connect it quickly, we'll be in trouble. 5 parts of the Compromise of 1850. All you need to know is 3 of them, and they are the first 3. Don't worry about the last 2. Okay? California enters as a free state. There's a new harsher fugitive slave law, and Utah and New Mexico are organized and allowed popular sovereignty, but there's no slavery because you can't grow anything. Flip to 19. Sure, go ahead. Yep. That's the fugitive slave law. So that's a good. So what Sabrina asked, like Timor, what was it where judges got paid more for a guilty verdict? In the fugitive slave law, if the fugitive slave faced a judge, the judge was paid $5 if they said the fugitive slave was innocent, could stay in the north, and $10 if the fugitive slave was guilty and was sent back south. What's any judge going to do? Guilty. Make more, you make double the money. All right, 19. Uncle Tom's Cabin, don't worry about the impending crisis of the South. I mean, it's nice if you know it, no worries. Bleeding Kansas is what happens after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We talked Republican Party, we talked Dred Scott. Panic of 1857 does not impact the South because cotton stays high. Lincoln-Douglas debates. Usually you don't see John Brown or Harper's Ferry, but if it's there, that's the raid that John Brown tried to organize. Potawatomi Creek is when he shot or killed 5 pro-slavery acts in Kansas. We talked election of 1860 and James Buchanan. Normally you don't need to know the candidates in the election of 1860, but it's there. If you know it, fine. If not, no big deal. Okay. All right, let's go to 20. Ben, would you be so kind as to read the summary on chapter 20, 2-0, please? And we're going to do 20 and 21 together as well, because this is about the war.
South Carolina Fort Sumner around the North End. Lincoln's call for troops to suppress the rebellion drove 4 other South states of courage. Lincoln used an effective combination of political persuasion and forced the region around border states in the Union. The Confederacy enjoyed initial advantages of the upper class European support, military leadership, and offensive position on its own soil. The North enjoyed the advantages of lower class European support, industrial and population resources, and political leadership. The British upper class sympathized with the South and embedded Confederate remodeling support efforts. But effective diplomacy and even military success was efforts and kept Britain as well as France neutral in the war. Lincoln's political leadership proved effective in mobilizing the North for the war, despite political opposition and resistance to its intention on civil liberties. The North eventually mobilized its larger troop resources for war and ultimately turned into an unpopular and unfair draft system. The Northern economy and economic financial strengths enabled it to gain an advantage over the less industrialized South. The changes in society opened new opportunities for women who had contributed significantly to the war effort in both the North and South. Since most of the war was waged on Southern and Southern. The South was left devastated by the war.
Flip to 21, we'll do it together because both chapters are about the war. Doug, would you be so kind, the chapter summary on 21. And anything military here for the most part you don't need to know. I made the list of what you'll see Civil War wise. Here, take that one. No worries.
Under the Union naval blockade, but a slow but devastating economic nose produced around the South. The political and diplomatic decisions of the war became critical. In order to retain the border states, Lincoln first diminished any intention to destroy slavery for the Battle of
Antietam, yep.
In 1862, enabled Lincoln to prevent foreign intervention and turn the struggle into a war against slavery. Blacks and abolitionists joined enthusiastically in a war for emancipation, for white resentment in part of the North created political problems. The Union victories at Vicksburg in the West and Gettysburg in the East finally turned the military tide against the South. Southern resistance remained strong, but the Union victories at Atlanta and Mobile assured Lincoln's success in the election of 1864, and as the last Confederate hopes, the war ended the issues of disunion and slavery, but at a tremendous cost to both North and South.
Okay, let's try and do this without looking at the chart in the key terms. Somebody help me out. Northern advantages in the Civil War. What was one thing the North had an advantage of? We'll go Daniel and then Ann.
Industrial.
Yeah, clearly the industry. There's no doubt that. And how many iron foundries were there in the South in the Civil War when the war began? One. How many were there in the North? I don't know. Yeah, a lot is. I hate it when you all use a lot. You could use a lot for how many were there. Anna, what's another?
I was gonna say railroads.
Yep, railroads. 80% of the railroads are in the North. obviously they can move goods and supplies quicker. What's another? Go for it, Natalia, then Aiden Kefever, and then Aiden No. Population, absolutely. This is why Lincoln hires Ulysses S. Grant finally to be the Union General, because Grant realized if the same number of Northerners and the same number of Southerners were killed, who would win that war? The North, right? Because they'd have more Northerners left. Phenomenal, fantastic, very good. Aiden Kefever.
You took my thought, but I still have one. Would the Erie Canal be one because of like ships being?
I'm not going to argue with that. So the idea of, how shall I word this? I'm going to put connection to the West. And here's why that was so important. The South thought they had a better connection to the West than the North did. But because of the Erie Canal and the railroad system, the North actually connected to the West quicker, easier, better. Well played. Mr. Nunnall.
The North had the Navy, and they also had like better technology.
Yes, technology advanced, better technology, and the North establishes a naval blockade. One of the most famous movies about the Confederacy is called Gone with the Wind, and it talks about the star of it, Red Scarlet was his name, Red Butler, I'm sorry, and he and his love interest, Scarlett O'Hara, and Red Butler was paid by the Confederacy to try and break the naval blockade. Okay, pretty good. What about Southern advantages? Adisa?
Better battle tactics.
Yes, better generals, better military training, all of that. Most of the West Point graduates were Southerners, so they have better military training, absolutely. Another, Sabrina. Yeah, the South just has to hold territory. Where's the complexity point here? Let's think about our own country, the United States. What's the complexity point of another area that just had to hold territory? Where am I going with this, Anna?
During the Revolutionary War.
That's right. Okay, so the South just has to hold. If the South holds, they win. So they are fighting a defensive war. Just hold their new 11 states, and if they're able to do that, they win. Good. What's another advantage for the South? Go ahead, Lisa.
They had a better relationship with the Belgian countries with cotton.
At least at first, it seemed like their cotton would give them a relationship with especially Britain and France. Now, let's do the complexity point. What document, a singular document, is going to kill that relationship? Emancipation Proclamation, right? So this is true until that. Timing of Lincoln, right? So, hello, you all have gotten rid of slavery. They have. Britain did it throughout the British Empire in the 1830s, France the early 1840s. So you can't support. But at first, Adisa is absolutely right. Initially, that's an advantage. There's one more big advantage that I can think of. What am I thinking of, maybe? Or what are you thinking of?
They want to work on unity process.
Yes. They're fighting for their way of life, politically, economically, socially. They are united by cause. There were Northerners, more than a few, who said, forget it. They want to be their own slave-holding country, then let it be. Okay? Now, let's see how we did, first of all. I guess I'll look at my key terms and see how we did. Population, industrialization, railroads, technology. We should add that, right? A more diversified economy. The Southern economy is a one-trick pony. It's cotton, that's it. And that is an advantage for sure. Good. Okay. Let's go down before we go through the key events of the Civil War. What made Lincoln so great? His timing. Somebody give me an example of that. What's one example? Go ahead, Daniel.
Emancipation Proclamation.
Absolutely, right? He waits for a Union victory at Antietam, any Union victory he was looking for, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and the way he worded it. Technically, how many slaves did the Emancipation Proclamation free? Technically, none. Why? Because he had to keep the border states. So he said, all slaves in revolting territories are now free. But were revolting territories technically a separate country at that time? Boom. Doug, you have one, my friend.
Sending troops to the south.
Yes. Well, be careful, not to the south, because there you go. So, what makes him so great? His timing. Let's see if we can add something. So, one is the Emancipation Proclamation. the way he worded it and when he released it. Sending troops to the border states, excellent. And why does he want the border states? Well, it adds to the population advantage, but he also controls the river systems that way. He's famous for saying, I would love to have God on my side, but I must have, anybody remember which border state? Kentucky. Okay? So that's all right. I mean, that's not going to be in the AP test, it's more trivial, but you get the idea. Go ahead, Anna.
He passed like a bunch of acts, like the homestead and the.
That's awesome. Anna Gursky from the corner for 3, and it's good swish. Because the South had left, all these states' rights Democrats were out of Congress. And Lincoln's timing says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to pass 4 major acts in no particular order. I'm going to pass the Pacific Railroad Act, which is going to build that transcontinental railroad with government money. Now he hires Oaks Ames, who's corrupt. That's a little issue. But still, I'm going to pass the Homestead Act, giving cheap land in the West. I'm going to pass the National Banking Act to set up a banking system again. Not a bank of the U.S., but at least a banking system. And I am a Republican. I represent the North. I'm going to pass an act that does what to the tariff? I'm a Northern Republican. It is either raise or lower, but let's be clear, okay? Southern Democrats always want to do what to the tariff? Northern Republicans or Whigs always want to do what to the tariff? Raise. So he does raise the tariff as well. Okay? Excellent. More government, bigger government. All those states' right Southerners are out of the government. Go ahead, Grace.
What does it say before the independence?
Here?
No, like.
There?
No, like under that?
Here?
No, no.
Right, Southern in France, the word.
Oh, relating to Britain and France. REL period. So, yep, go ahead, Lisa. Absolutely, his timing as well. The Gettysburg Address, which is the second time that he'll change the war cause. One other thing about his timing, there's a state that he allows in that goes completely, I guess 2 other things. In 2 areas, he goes completely against the Constitution. One, West Virginia. And the other is that he suspends habeas corpus, meaning you're basically allowed to be, it's sort of like the Sedition Acts. You can be thrown in jail if the government says you should be. And he says, well, tough, wartime, we think you're against the war cause. All right, let's go through my cute little handy-dandy Civil War list here. Fort Sumter, what's Fort Sumter in relation to the Civil War? First battle, who fired the first shot? South. Timing of Lincoln, right? Lincoln resupplies Fort Sumter. He doesn't send ammunition. Antietam, a lot of you forget this because we just gloss over. It is the Union victory. It's in Maryland. It pushes the South back south. Maryland was a border state. But more importantly, it leads directly to Lincoln can now issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the first time that the reason for the war changed. Initially, right up here, right before Fort Sumter, Lincoln said the war is about what? Well done. Restoring the nation. Initially, the war was about saving the Union. That's how he sells it to start. Then the Emancipation Proclamation becomes about saving the Union and freeing the slaves. He'll change it again 1 year later with the Gettysburg Address. Anybody remember, by the way, the Gettysburg Address, we know, was that speech in its day seen as some great piece of American oratory? No, right? He was booed. It was so short. But what's the point of it, Anna?
Preserving enlightenment.
That's exactly right. So here, the Gettysburg Address is also about preserving Enlightenment ideas in government. Because you can't have a government with Enlightenment ideas if it has slavery. This is genius. The timing of Lincoln. That's why he's ranked #1 all time. After the Gettysburg Address, a year later, it's Sherman's March to less than a year later, it's Sherman's March to the Sea. What states does Sherman basically destroy? Georgia and then he comes up South Carolina. 60 miles wide in Georgia, almost 300 miles long from Atlanta to Savannah, and then up through South Carolina, 60 miles wide through by 150 miles long. This is total war. What is Sherman's goal in these areas that he's going through? What's his goal?
Basically just destroy infrastructure and make the South pay.
That's right. He wants to make the South cry. And is he, quite frankly, successful in doing so? He legit is. Atlanta, Savannah, Charleston, Columbia, 4 major southern cities that he just levels completely. He was so ruthless that he told Union soldiers, if you are in a plantation home and you see a family picture, burn it. I mean, it doesn't get much more personal than that, okay? One of his major targets was railroad lines. Why? If he crossed a railroad line, why was he told to destroy it, quite frankly? Tie it into Sherman bow ties.
No supply line.
No supply lines, okay? Did it work? Militarily, did it work? It really did, okay? Appomattox, if you see this word, this is where the war ends. It's a small courthouse in Virginia. General Lee from the Confederacy surrenders to General Grant, the same guy who would become President Grant, for the Union. So if you see that wording, that's where the war ends. Right before Appomattox, there are 2 things that Lincoln does. The timing of Lincoln. He pushes through the 13th Amendment, which said what? 13th Amendment did what? Right. So, well, be careful. There's 3 Reconstruction Amendments. This is the first one. The 13th Amendment is actually the most basic. It said what would be illegal in the United States? Slavery. So this is slavery and indentured servitude. So slavery and indentured servitude are now illegal in the United States. Big government. He also gets past the Freedmen's Bureau. Why was the Freedmen's Bureau something that Lincoln designed? Why was the, go for it, Anna?
To help replace slaves.
Yes. Okay, you're all good historians at this point. We've been together over 7 months. Was the Freedmen's Bureau necessary at the end of the Civil War? Was it needed? Absolutely. Why does it only last 7 years? It's part of it. Lincoln is assassinated. Why else? A little bit of Andrew Johnson. You're going a little too deep here. I can sum up in one word why it only lasts 7 years. Racism. Okay? How did all Southern whites and most Northern whites feel about the Freedmen's Bureau? Why are you doing this? And what? And it was almost like Me Too. All right, they're free, cool. Let them go. But the thing is that what skills did these freed slaves have outside of agriculture? Nothing. And what was the #1 success of the Freedmen's Bureau? Teaching people how to read and write. Notice I didn't say children. This was people who were as young as 5 and as old as 80. And they had a huge populace in doing so. But sadly, as Daniel alluded to, Lincoln is assassinated. Andrew Johnson is a Southerner. He tries to veto the Freedmen's Bureau. It passes over Congress's veto. Grant finally lets it expire because so much racism in the North and the South simply killed it. 5 days after the end of the war in Ford's Theater, while Abraham Lincoln, his wife, and another couple who were friends of those, go ahead, Matthew.
Is the Freedmen's Bureau the first government welfare agency?
Yes, this is the first. I've had students in the past compare this to the Square Deal. I've had students in the past compare this to the New Deal as complexity. It works very well there, okay? First government welfare agency ever. But it only lasts 7 years because of racism. 7 years, okay? Why do we care so much about the assassination of Lincoln? Go deeper than it was a national hero was killed. Why do we care about Lincoln's assassination? Go, Sabrina, sure. Would Reconstruction have been different if Lincoln had lived?
Yes.
Would it long term have been better for both the North and the South had Lincoln lived?
Yes.
Yes. He was able to navigate. He saw the South as sort of like that college son who was in a rebellion stage. More importantly than that analogy, after the Civil War, did white Southerners want to rejoin the Union? No. Did Lincoln know that? So he said, we got to do this gently. Did Andrew Johnson have the same touch as Lincoln had? Not even close. So you get military Reconstruction, which had some positives, But when it left, you abandoned African Americans for 75 years. It's that simple, okay? All right, well done with this. I'll give you a minute. We'll do one more chapter and then we'll take our break here because that'll be 5 down and then we'll actually have 4 to go because we'll do 23, 24, 25. I'm going to skip 26 because the only part you need to know is the reservation system. So we will do 22. Let's do Reconstruction. Let's see, who do I want to read? I don't know. You know what? Let's have Tessa read 22, please. Just a summary, please, my dear. The very last one in that packet.
With the Civil War over, the nation faced difficult problems as rebuilding the South, assisting freed slaves, reintegrating the Southern states into the Union, and deciding to direct the Reconstruction process. The South was economically devastated and socially revolutionized by emancipation. As slave owners reluctantly confronted the end of slave labor, blacks took their first steps in freedom. Black churches and freedmen's schools helped the former slaves begin to shape their own destiny. The new president, Andrew Johnson, was politically inept and personally contentious. His attempt to implement a moderate plan of reconstruction along the lines originally suggested by Lincoln fell victim to Southern whites' severe treatment of blacks and his own political blunders. Republicans imposed harsh military reconstruction in the South after the ending of 1866 congressional elections. Southern states re-entered the Union with new radical governments, which rested partly on newly enfranchised blacks, but also had support from some sectors of Southern society. These regimes were sometimes corrupt, but also implemented important reforms. The divisions between moderate and radical Republicans meant that Reconstruction aims were often limited and confused, despite the important 14th and 15th Amendments. Embittered whites hated the radical governments and mobilized reactionary terrorist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan to restore white supremacy. Congress impeached Johnson but failed narrowly to convict him. In the end, the poorly conceived Reconstruction policy failed disastrously.
Okay, so this chapter really starts with the assassination of Lincoln, even though that's at the end of chapter 21. Because his second vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes the president of the United States. Now, Johnson and Lincoln weren't that close. Lincoln put Johnson on his ticket because Johnson was the only congressman from a Confederate state to keep his congressional seat. Johnson himself is a white Southerner. He hates the planter class, okay? But he really loves power. So anybody remember, even before Lincoln is assassinated, what percentage did Lincoln want to have of white Southerners swear an oath back to the Union in order for that union to go for it?
Is it 10?
10%. Yep, good. 10%. Why? Because he recognized the South was not that excited to come back in. Andrew Johnson tries to continue this 10% plan, and he adds to it, okay, but you know what? Any Confederate who wants their voting rights back has to come ask me for a pardon. That was a power trip on Andrew Johnson. And by the end of 1865, so many states, in Johnson's opinion, had been reconstructed that former Confederates were serving in Congress, which really upset Northern Republicans. Okay? So, Andrew Johnson's nickname is Sir Veto. Just for trivia's sake, anybody remember how many vetoes he had? How many was it? 21. And more importantly to me, out of these 21, 15 are overridden. Okay? Now, by 1866, Johnson really thinks that the American public are going to go, oh, I should put, one of those here was the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, that when he vetoed it, Congress gets so frustrated and says, we can't let him control this. It leads to the 14th Amendment. More on that in a minute. 1866, Johnson goes on a speaking tour of the United States, telling the American people that he's really the one who has the pulse on the American public at the time. Anybody remember how the reaction was to him on this speaking tour? How did people react to him? They threw things, they react horrendously to him, which will lead in the elections that year to a Republican supermajority in Congress. Now, why does that matter? Because it's no surprise that in 1867, the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867 will be passed. Johnson vetoes it. Does Johnson's veto matter by 1867? No. What does the Military Reconstruction Act say? What is going to be sent down to 10 out of the 11 southern states? Troops. Why? To protect they're there to ensure African Americans get the rights of the 13th, 14th, and newly passed at the time 15th Amendments. More on them in a minute. Okay? So, this is why federal troops are sent south. Now, the summary mentioned the KKK. How does the White South react to military reconstruction? How does the White South react to that? They hate it. This will lead directly to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. As proof of the harsh Southern reaction. However, we must be fair. Are these federal troops successful in ensuring that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments get enforced while in the South? Yes, because it also leads to African American males voting. By the way, why are women so upset with the 15th Amendment? Because they're upset.
They're not included.
Why, yeah, right? What about us? This will also lead to African Americans holding office in the South. Okay? So this will last for 10 years, until 1877. Uh-oh. What happens in 1877? Another delightful compromise, not written by Henry Clay, even dead. What happens in that compromise of 1877? It ends military reconstruction because who gets elected president? The famous
Hayes.
Rutherford B. Hayes. I don't really care if you remember him because he's a forgettable president. I do care that you remember his policy. He's a Gilded Age president, so his policy is what? So it allows southern states to do whatever they want. And what do they immediately pass after those troops leave? Black codes. And what happens to African Americans in the South for 70 years? Oppression, sharecropping, right? So, once military reconstruction ends, and it ends with the Compromise of 1877, which really has three parts. Part one, Republican Hayes becomes president. That's what the North got. The South gets two things. One, they get the end of military reconstruction. Anybody remember what else they get? And this is trivial. I mean, it's not gonna, if it shows up, it's great if you know it, but if not, they get the Southern Transcontinental Railroad built, government money. It is. So that Houston to Los Angeles, which was talked about way back here, supposed to be the first one, does get built, but it's the second transcontinental railroad. Okay? And what will this lead to? Once this Compromise of 1877 is passed, you get, it's actually oddly in the book in chapter 23, black codes, you get sharecropping, you get Jim Crow laws, which were specific black codes, which segregated. And then just for the icing on the cake, in quotes, sadly you get Plessy versus Ferguson that said, yep, this is all legal. Finally, next week we'll overturn that. Okay, positives and negatives of Reconstruction. That's what the SAQ example from 2 years ago, that one was from 2021, talked about. So I give you one positive, the Freedmen's Bureau. But really, what's the biggest positives of Reconstruction that are still with us today, thankfully? Yeah, the Reconstruction Amendments. 13, banned slavery. 14, citizenship. And citizenship is, the rights of citizenship are guaranteed to all Americans, so that if you are born in this country, you are a citizen. And the 15th, voting rights for all males, regardless of ethnic background. And then I might argue as well, temporary diversity in political office. Unfortunately, it's temporary, it's only 10 years. But there's temporary diversity in political office holders. Negatives, well, after the Compromise of 1877, in this case, the American pageant says it well, African Americans are simply abandoned. We killed these very challenging chapters, so I'm impressed. 5 down, 4 to go. Like I said, we're not going to go ahead, Doug. Yes, absolutely, 100%. No, that's okay. So let's take, we got a little time. We have 4 chapters left, so we're in good shape. Go ahead, Adam.
Why did the North need a compromise?
Great question. So because of military reconstruction, oddly, 3 states in the South, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, send in 2 sets of electoral college delegates. The Democratic candidate, a guy named Sam Tilden, needed 1 electoral college vote out of any of those 3 states. Not 1 state, 1 vote to become the next president. These are southern states. Do you think he probably would have got 1 electoral college vote? Sure. But this is in dispute because of military reconstruction. Basically, federal troops sent in votes that were all Republican. State legislatures sent in votes that were all Democrat. Okay? So, meanwhile, this goes all the way to February, and March was the inauguration day. So, they designed a compromise, which was, by the way, if you're wondering, it was a group of 15 people, 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, and said, let our guy become the president. And the South said, what do we get? All right, we'll pull the troops out. So that's why it happened. President Hayes probably wasn't ever really elected. His nickname amongst historians is Rutherford Fraud. Sam Tilden won the popular vote, and the fact that southern states wouldn't have given him 1 electoral college vote, very unlikely. But there were technically 2 sets of returns, and that's the reason. Go ahead, Anastasia.
What does it say under Southern?
Where am I at?
It's like, what was the effects of the compromise of 1877?
Southern Railroad built the other questions. Okay, let's resume to 7:15. We got 3 major topics done: causes of the Civil War Reconstruction. We'll do Gilded Age, and we'll do imperialism, and that will be that. Gilded Age, we'll do 3 chapters. Chapter 26. Here's what you have to know: Indian Wars, 1865 to 1890. After Wounded Knee leads to the reservation system.
It's just so much that it's so much that needs to be done.
Was it like ringing? Oh, did you?
It is hydronic acid.
Yep. Okay, when you gotta go, just go. Like, I get it. I know teachers aren't supposed to have favorites, but look what you've done here. Like, I'm just saying.
See you tomorrow.
Hey, take care, Aiden. Good job tonight. Okay, so Finney in 2nd grade awakening, the reforms that come after this whole chapter is 2nd grade awakening. So then we list the 9 reforms there.
Second grade awakening is.
Katie Standing, Susan B. Anthony, and the Senator Falls Convention. I would add declaration of sentiments there. All men and women of faith.
It was in
Second grade awakening is like 1830s.
Noah Webster, Horace Mann, education
After the
reform.
War of 1812.
No, I said.
Yeah.
First
Well,
dictionary. Oh, National
Yeah,
Identity.
he runs
Where it
programs
comes from.
from
The language, yep.
During your good feelings and the
Dorothea Dix, mental health service reform.
and the remnants persist for longer.
And then Thoreau, obviously.
Children somewhere. Writing them just helps with the.
Everybody loves transcendentalism.
I don't know, I think I might love poetry.
So it's going well. Cotton gin, plantation system.
So what was it like, peer reviewing the SAQs today?
I was like, yeah, sure, that says that. Like, it is.
These two go together. The South thought slavery was a positive good because they said that they were better treated than northern wage slaves in factories. At least they had food, a household.
That's all.
We can go over there.
Anna's a little odd.
In theory, like I covered all that. And then we have that almost exactly. We've been here serving the. Yes, sir.
It was the election of.
1876, leading to the compromise of 1877.
This is jogging a memory. I told my mom, like, well, there's no way I'm gonna be ready for this AP test. Yeah, and then I go and it's like, it's crazy. I know that stuff.
You know more than you think.
It's just, I'm gonna watch that review because, like, the one from, like, first semester.
Oh, you mean as far as like 1 through 8? Like when we did
Well,
that?
I went to 1 through 8. I'm talking about like 9 through 17.
Oh, yeah.
And then I gotta go through the Princeton review, highlight bolded terms, and take notes out. Just so I like get a review. And then I'm gonna watch the Heinlein review just to refresh like 2 days before the test.
Lincoln likes him because
He doesn't like the law. Yes. Yeah. Don't underthink it. And here's what I mean by that. Goodness, you the prompt is the quote from the Gospel of 1850. They want you to pass this. They really do. They want to see it as a place where students are positioned for it. You can use anything. In other words, you can use the reaction to the slave law. You can use it as upsets down now in the Senate. The best example I can give you, the fact is sort of like an outside evidence piece.
Wait, we have till 45, right?
Probably going to be
I don't
okay.
know.
You justify it.
We have till 45?
The biggest thing from the bill today is that if, let's say, we were looking at Reconstruction, and somebody said, oh, can I use, I don't know, the NAACP?
I'll put any causation in any form of safety. And he still got 4 points. So he's.
Yes, you can use it as causation, which is not. And that happens sometimes. But the fact is very limited. Do they have some, a person, place, or thing that they can point to that relates to something? Does that make sense? Yes.
I still got the credit.
Congress won 50%.
On top.
Yep. I should have said that. Congress won. Well, Johnson still won.
The Great Depression
That was something.
I don't know what.
That's what got him in trouble. Johnson versus Congress. You see? Yes, sir. That back door over there. No, the other back door. You'll see it. 5-minute warning, group. 5 minutes. Hurry. Yeah.
What the heck is this for?
No idea.
Because it doesn't pop up.
I know.
I'm like, what?
I mean, I think it's like that. I mean, I've had to move these several times, and I say every time, like, why is there a flat that does nothing but add weight and make these heavier?
Yeah, what? Like, it just makes me.
Yeah.
It's gonna draft you into the NFL.
Well, no, actually, you should do me that tomorrow. No, you should be like, this is what I got. See, there's nothing, there's no point.
It's a knee guard. It just defends your knees. You know, some pressure
I got 20 out of 20.
Awesome, it's like somebody's 7th round pick was Anna Carson.
You know, did we actually like cover chapter 6 in class or 26 in class?
No, because we Heimlered that one extraordinaire because 26 is super long in detail about like the cattle drive and whatnot. Basically, it's the Indian Wars, and after Wounded Knee, it's the reservation system. And I should put.
So basically, it's what do we do with the Indians during the Gilded Age?
Yeah.
Did I do my final project about cowboys?
Yeah.
That sounds like fun.
Just show up in like full cowboys because I
No,
am
I want to
protected.
make a Wild West. We have to see that.
I'll show up in full cowboy dress. I'm Texas, so it'll just work.
And I'll be your
3 minutes. 3 minutes. Let's go. 3 minutes. 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
Yeah, but Firefly. Still mine.
Ava, when did you arrive?
Just now.
Okay. I'm glad you said that because part of me was like, if I missed her, I would feel really bad after an hour, you know?
I should have like this whole time. I was scared.
Yeah, because I mean.
Actually sitting right in front of me.
Oh, I know.
Well, I already have a billion things. I think we can work in groups.
You can work in groups, it can be same class or different classes, like it's very, the only thing about different classes is that you have to coordinate your presentations.
Yeah, I'm not going to be
That's pretty good. Like, yes, I like that a lot. Like that could be outstanding. Like seriously.
If I send like a little picture or something, how much you gotta present it?
So it depends on what you do. Like if you do artwork, what I don't want is, here's my artwork, okay? You need about 5 minutes of why, talk me through your project, number one, and what is the historical significance. Like that's really sort of what I'm looking for. So those ceiling tiles that you see, some of the presentations were off the charts amazing. And there's some that were like, well, my ceiling tile. Why would you take it? Why that? What's the historical connection? What's the connection to the class? Something like that.
These important things in the street.
I mean, I'm not opposed. So 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute.
So my table thinks yeah, so we just need to do a presentation on why it's
I did that 1 year. There's a fact was, you don't have to lie.
I mean, it's American history, so.
It really is just cool. This is the survey for those of you who have.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
We did during the year.
Before you leave, but then I mean, like, in like the follow, it's like once words are ahead or behind. Right now, you have to go any summary.
So being small, you've done civil rights next week, we do the Scouts and Cowboys, which I know you're going to do. So anyway, there's a day where we do a survey on that. And then obviously, there's 4 weeks on your title projects. And I want to get that.
You don't have to worry about the
Yes, as far as the amount of work is a lot, but it's based on, you know,
don't worry, I just hang around the edge of
Hi, everybody, we'll be back in 10, 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We shift the Gilded Age through the next 3 chapters: Gilded Age Politics, Gilded Age Economics, Gilded Age Social Conditions, and we celebrate with a brand new packet. Hooray, new packet. It starts with 22, but we've already done that one as a duplicate. We switched to 23, which is the politics of the Gilded Age. I will kindly ask Sophie, if she would be so kind, Sophie Hopkins, to read the chapter summary on chapter 23, political paralysis in the Gilded Age.
After the soaring ideals and treacherous sacrifices of the Civil War, the post-Civil War era was generally one of the most disillusionment. Politicians from the White House to the courthouse were often surrounded by corruption and scandal, while the actual problems afflicting industrializing America festered beneath the surface. The popular war hero Grant was a poor politician, and his administration was rife with corruption. Despite the occasional futile reform efforts, politics in the Gilded Age were monopolized by the 2 patronized Batten parties, which competed rigorously for spoils, while essentially agreeing on most national policies. Cultural differences, different constituencies, and deeply felt local issues fueled intense party competition and unprecedented voter participation. Periodic complaints by mud reformers and money-soft advocates failed to make such a dent in politics. A deadlocked contested 1876 election led to the sectional compromise of 1877, which put an end to Reconstruction. An oppressive system of tenant farming and racial supremacy and segregation was therefore fastened on the South. Enforced by sometimes lethal violence, racial and prejudice against Chinese immigrants were also linked with labor unrest in the 1870s and 1880s. Garfield's assassination by a disappointed office seeker spurred the beginnings of the civil service reform, which made politics more dependent on big business. Cleveland, the first Democratic president since the Civil War, made a lower tariff in the first real issue in national politics for some time, but his mild reform efforts were eclipsed by a major economic depression that began in 1893, a crisis that deepened the growing outcry for suffering farmers and workers against a government and economic system that seemed biased towards big business and the wealthy.
All right, I appreciate that. That's not an easy chapter because I don't really like the way this chapter presents things, and yet the order it goes in, and yet what it presents is very important. This is Gilded Age politics, and you'll notice what I'm starting with: laissez-faire from the government perspective, and the forgettable presidents. I'm going to list them just for the sake of listing them. They're forgettable because you don't really need to know who they are. You need to know their laissez-faire policies. It's nice to know only one of them is a Democrat and they act like a Republican. So first of all, Grant, who was a 2-term president, a Republican. the Credit Mobilier scandal, one of the largest things I put under the corruption heading in politics in the Gilded Age. And we'll get to Boss Tweed in a minute. Credit Mobilier had to do with what industry? Railroads, right? This is the building of the first transcontinental railroad. And this is where we meet Congressman Oakes Ames. Oakes Ames was basically hired by Abraham Lincoln when, as Anna mentioned a few minutes ago, the Pacific Railroad Act got passed in 1862. Said, hey, Oakes, coordinate the budget for the first transcontinental railroad. And Oakes Ames says, excellent, I'd love to. And they formed the Credit Mobilier Construction Company to help build said transcontinental railroad. What's the problem with the Credit Mobilier Construction Company? So they charge too much, and Oakes Ames comes up with an idea. He gives stock options to basically all congressmen and the vice president. Well, not only that, Credit Mobilier charges more than market value, much more, maybe 300% more. Everybody's happy, everybody's thrilled, until the New York Times uncovers this corruption. President Grant is exempt from this corruption, but he doesn't do anything to stop it, right? We'll get to the boss in a second. Meanwhile, President Hayes is the president who takes office because of the Compromise of 1877. He is perhaps known best for the Great Railroad Strike of the same year and his response to it. The strike spreads to 11 different states. And how does President Hayes respond to the Great Railroad Strike? First, he's laissez-faire, but as it goes on, he sends something to send workers back to work. Not, he sends the U.S. Army, so he'll send federal troops. Seems the only time that these guys aren't laissez-faire is when there's some sort of labor unrest where federal troops will be sent to stop it. We move to James Garfield, who ran on a platform of, we're going to get corruption out of politics. We're going to get corruption out of the Republican Party. But you'll notice I've listed Garfield from 1881 to 1881. What happens to poor old James Garfield? Go for it, Daniel.
He gets assassinated by Charles Guiteau.
Charles Guiteau. And what does Charles Guiteau want from James Garfield? Why does he kill him? What does he want?
He wants a job.
He wants a job. Okay? So Garfield loses his life because Charles Guiteau expects a job in the spoils system. By the way, who invented the spoils system? Jackson. So, interestingly, a much more corrupt human than the Republican Garfield will take over, and that is Chet Arthur. Arthur never wanted to be president, but Arthur will do two things during his time from 1881 to 1885. He doesn't run again. He's also a Republican. And the first thing he does is get the Pendleton Act passed. He says, my friend James Garfield will not die in vain. And the Pendleton Act says that for most government jobs, you must take and pass a what?
Test.
A test. So therefore, the Pendleton Act means government jobs go back to talent over loyalty. The other thing that old Chet Arthur gets passed is the first time in all of American history that we tell a group of individuals from a singular ethnicity that they can't come here anymore. So what am I thinking of there? The Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese simply cannot come. The thinking was is that the transcontinental railroads were basically built, therefore there were no jobs for the Chinese anymore, and therefore the Panic of 1873, which had stretched for 6 years, the longest panic in American history as far as continuous economic downturn, okay, was blamed on the fact that therefore, if we get the Chinese out, there'll be more jobs, right? Okay, Chet Arthur doesn't run, and you get the first ever Democrat, which was Grover Cleveland, at least the first Democrat of the Gilded Age and the only one. But Grover Cleveland will act like a Republican. He was just as laissez-faire as all of the rest of them. Because of that, in response, what is going to form, because Grover Cleveland doesn't stand for farmers and labor? The Populist Party. The Populists must form. We'll talk more about the Populist Party platform when we get to the era of progressive reform. It forms because even though Grover Cleveland says he's a Democrat, the Democrats don't stand for them either. For farmers or labor. In between the two Clevelands, he serves 2 non-consecutive terms. You get the most forgettable of all. I'm going to actually put him over here. Can anybody tell me what Benjamin Harrison did when he was president?
Nothing.
Aiden Nuttall from the corner for 3, and it's good swish. The only thing I can tell you about Benjamin Harrison, does anybody watch Pawn Stars? Rick Harrison is related to him directly. That's all I got. He's also the only president from the state of Indiana. So that's correct. You get a Pawn Star reference. Well, you could say, well, what about Sherman Antitrust Act? Yeah, he signed it. He had nothing to do with it. Congress drew it up. Meanwhile, the last of these forgettable presidents, or the last presidents of the Gilded Age, was McKinley. He's most interesting to us for what he'll do with imperialism, and also because who ran against him? Or what movie was he sort of based the main character on? He's Oz in The Wizard of Oz. He is the big business Republican who defeats the populist candidate William Jennings Bryan. Okay? Now, the one thing we didn't cover is this guy, Boss Tweed, William Magyar Tweed. We know him well. First of all, what political party was Boss Tweed? He's a Democrat. What city is he from?
New York.
New York. How did he make his money? Who did he exploit? Specifically, what kind of immigrants usually? Irish. He used them all, but he starts with Irish immigrants, gives them a home in a beautiful tenement apartment, gives them a job in a beautiful factory, and says, you will vote Democrat. If they didn't come out and vote Democrat, did Boss Tweed go find them?
Yes.
Absolutely he did, right? So these Irish immigrants had to vote Democrat so that all Democrats could control New York. Why? Because then Democrats would give contracts only to companies that gave kickbacks. To who? Boss. So what do I mean by that? Well, for example, the Brooklyn Bridge is being built. And the company that would construct the Brooklyn Bridge, in fact, the companies, the steel company, the cable company, the lighting company, all had to give Boss a personal kickback. Does Boss Tweed become wealthy off of this? Wearing a pendant that's worth $1 million when asked why? Because I can. Who is Boss Tweed's arch nemesis who will end up bringing him down? Thomas Nast. This is Nast's second target. Thomas Nast is a Republican. He is a cartoonist. And he will bring down Boss Tweed. When Boss is in Spain, he's actually asked, aren't you the fat man from those cartoons from #America? Oh, no, I'm not. Yeah, you are. Right? Anybody remember Thomas Nast's first target, by the way? Not Jackson. Andrew Johnson. Nast will target him as well. Nast loved Lincoln, hated Andrew Johnson. Okay. So sorry, I mean, you're talking to a guy named Tim Moore. I mean, it's hard for me to, get behind you.
Tim Moore is,
So go ahead, Sabrina. Where am I at here? Immigrants vote Democrat. These Democrats then give contracts only to companies that give kickbacks to Boss Tweed. Okay? All right, let me check the terms here, because this chapter is a little funky. when it comes to the order it goes in. So we look at the key terms. Chapter 23, let's see, Boss Tweed, Thomas Nast, Tammany Hall. Yes, Tammany Hall was New York's Boss Tweed's political machine. Yep. Freddie Mobier we talked about. Republican hard money policies. Republicans wanted all things paid for in gold. Why? It favored big business. Populists wanted inflation. Compromise of 1877, we talked about literacy tests, Jim Crow laws. Civil rights cases don't usually come up. Plessy versus Ferguson we got. Chinese Exclusion Act, Garfield, Great Railroad Strike. I'll add the Homestead Strike. Homestead Strike was at whose steel plant? Andrew Carnegie's. Yep. So the Homestead Strike is Carnegie's steel plant. Same thing happened, except it was state militia. It never got to the federal troops level. And then the last thing in this chapter was the Panic of 1893. Shame on me, I actually thought that this was in chapter 24 in the economics chapter. What's most interesting about this is that when the Treasury went under $100 million, who bailed the country out? J.P. Morgan, who's just a plain old banker. Well, not a plain old banker. He's the richest banker in the country. But he proves that he had more power than the U.S. government. The ultimate laissez-faire that an independent private citizen has to bail out the country. Yay! All right. Let's go to 24, my friend. I'll give you a minute to catch up.
When was the Homestead Strike?
1892. 1892. All right, we move to Gilded Age Economics. When he's ready, we'll have Matthew Devaney himself please read the Gilded Age Economics. I'm just going to get my fries, to be honest with you.
Don't worry, I'll start. Just for you.
All right, Matthew, if you would, please. So, chapter 24.
Aided by government subsidies and loans, the first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869 and soon followed by others. This rail network opened vast new markets and prompted industrial growth. The power and corruption of the railroads led to public demand and regulation which only minimally done. New technology and forms of business organizations led to the growth of huge corporate trusts. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller led the way in the steel and oil industries. Initially, the oil industry supplied kerosene for lamps. It eventually expanded by providing gasoline to fuel automobiles. Cheap steel transformed industry from construction to rail building, and powerful railroads dominated the industry and reshaped American society. The benefits of industrialization were unevenly distributed. The South remained an underdeveloped dependence, while the industrial working class struggled at the bottom of the growing class division of American society. Increasingly transformed from independent producers and farmers to dependent wage earners, America's workers became vulnerable to illness, industrial accidents, and unemployment. Workers' attempts at labor organization were generally ineffective. The Knights of Labor disappeared after the Haymarket bombing. Gombrich founded the AFL to organize skilled craft laborers, but ignored most industrial workers, women, and blacks.
Okay. So, this chapter basically has four little parts to make one big umbrella of Gilded Age economics. It starts with the transcontinental railroads. Originally, true or false, did the government fund the transcontinental railroads to start with?
Yes.
They do, in two manners. Anybody remember one way the government funded these to start with? Land grants, right? They actually give away land to railroad companies that was equal to the state of Texas. So the government funds their land grants. And I think somebody said the other way, what else does the government do? Just gives loans out. Plain old money to be paid back, and the railroads were profitable enough that they did pay those loans back for the most part. Okay? We start with, at the beginning of the Gilded Age in 1865, how many transcontinental railroads did we have?
0.
By the end of the Gilded Age, 1900, how many transcontinental railroads did we have? 5. This will reshape everything. I mean, from travel to diet to farming to prices of goods to everything. Okay? Now that's a very big umbrella term, but let's see if we can say this in a manner that is a little bit more acute. Before the Gilded Age, okay, most people in the United States, going all the way back to colonial America, made their money how? Farming, right? So before this, Americans were farmers. And not that farming wasn't still around, but the number one job will change. Will change to railroads and steel. You needed steel to build the tracks. You could even argue the locomotives, but certainly the tracks. So that's kind of mini part 1 of the chapter. The other thing is that if a railroad did not go through your town, what happened to your town? He gone. Ghost town. If a railroad went through your town, did your town thrive? Okay? And new towns popped up for transportation. Then there's this whole section on Carnegie and Rockefeller. So let's start with the basics. Carnegie, how did he make his money? What industry was he in? Steel. And he'll become the largest steel maker in the world. We'll get to a piece of technology, I want to write it down so I don't forget it, the Bessemer process, that will allow Carnegie to make the best steel in the world. And it was the best steel in the world at that time. What type of integration did Carnegie use to control? Vertical integration, meaning that what parts of the business process did Carnegie control? All of it, right? So Carnegie uses vertical integration. Disney tries to use this today. They're not the only company. But they're a fairly easy one for us to wrap our heads around, where he's controlling all parts of the business model. All the steps. Andrew Carnegie becomes the ideal American. Why? He's a Scottish immigrant, works his way up to one of the richest men in the world. And then he invents this idea that you should give back to, and what am I thinking of there? The gospel of wealth. Does he drink the Kool-Aid? Does he actually give a lot of money back to these projects? Maybe as much as 75%. It's his idea, the gospel of wealth, that says give back. Carnegie Hall, Carnegie Libraries, Carnegie Mellon University. Okay? This would be copied by others like Vanderbilt, university's named after him, Sanford, a railroad baron, Rockefeller Center, whom John D. Rockefeller's family would build in New York. Rockefeller himself would fund, and his son, would fund the elimination of hookworm in the South. So the millionaire barons would take the gospel of wealth seriously. We'll get back to that in a minute. Let's move to Rockefeller. What industry did Rockefeller make his money in? Oil. Standard Oil. His guarantee is that he was going to give you a quality product at a cheap price. Nothing wrong with that. But what was his real goal? In eliminating the competition. And was he pretty damn close to being successful in doing so? What kind of integration is that called? Horizontal integration. His goal is to either buy you out or put you out of business. And he was darn successful at it. He could be ruthless in virtually all things, but you need to know that A, he did produce a quality product at a cheap price, and at the beginning of the Gilded Age, oil was needed for kerosene to light kerosene lamps. Well, we've got another Gilded Age technology, the electric light, that will put kerosene obsolete in time. By the end of the Gilded Age, an obvious question in our modern America, why was oil needed at that point? Cars, because very end of the Gilded Age, you start to lead to the automobile rise. Okay? Good. Now, Gilded Age technology, Bessemer process, electric light. Bessemer process was a process that perfected the making of exactly what? Steel. And if you're wondering, you want the technical terms, it's blowing cold air on it when steel is the hottest. It would make the strongest steel in the world. It's basically still used. But more importantly, it's a process for making steel that Carnegie would perfect. Now, why was steel so important? Yes, railroad tracks is one reason. Well done. Revolutionize a city, because now you could build up. You could build skyscrapers. Very good. Okay? Electric light we talked about. What else? There's at least one more major invention of the Gilded Age that we need to mention. Telephone. Okay? Telephone is a Gilded Age invention. Alexander Graham Bell. You could also add to this in a similar vein the transatlantic cable, which was originally a telegraph cable. Telegraph is a market revolution invention, but the cable is a Gilded Age invention. It's first telegraph, later it would obviously be telephones, okay? Then you have the rise of labor unions, and there's a little surprise at the end of this chapter that basically all of this can fall under except transcontinental railroads. Labor unions, well, let's name at least two. What is the largest labor union in the country at the time? Go for it, Sabrina. Knights of Labor. And they really were, and they welcomed everyone. They're very inclusive. If you want the numbers, they had about 750,000 in 1886. That year is picked for a reason, because it's the year that a certain bomb goes off after the McCormick Reaper strike in Chicago that's going to kill 8 Chicago police officers. What neighborhood does that bomb go off in?
Haymarket Square.
Haymarket Square. So why do we care about Haymarket Square? Because even though we still to this day do not know who set that bomb off, what does labor look like in the face of the American public after Haymarket Square? Communists, anarchists, socialists. They are commies. Big frowny face. Right? And this one incident in May of 1884 will kill the Knights of Labor. So that's the one labor union we have to mention. The other labor union that I'd like to mention is the only one that's left at the end of the Gilded Age that's national. There's one left. Anybody remember which one that was? Go for it, Abe.
There's like the National Laborers. Was
Yeah,
it the UFFL?
AFL. That's what we're looking for. Good job. So the only one that's left is the American Federation of Labor. This is a labor union only for skilled workers. You had to have a trade, a carpenter, somebody who works with electrical light, someone with the skill, and it doesn't welcome in labor. Anybody remember how many percent of workers that were unionized at the end of the Gilded Age? And if you don't, do you think that number was high or that number was low? It's extremely low. It was only 3%. Okay, but we know this well. Were labor unions successful in the Gilded Age in getting rights for the worker?
No.
No. All of this could be under the umbrella of the following. The millionaires are born better. This, in one short sentence, is the summary of what sad philosophy of, what am I thinking of, Kira?
Social Darwinism.
This is social Darwinism to a T. By the Gilded Age, did the average American believe in social Darwinism, hook, line, and sinker? Yes, they did. The idea that even an Andrew Carnegie, who might not have been born rich, had some sort of fitness level skill above everybody else. So therefore, he deserved to become this millionaire, and he's so kind, he gave back to his employees. Oh, by the way, he also was the guy who ran the plant where the Homestead strike happened. Why am I pointing that out? Did he really need to cut wages by 20% like he did?
No.
No. It's an oxymoron, but it shows you how strong this is. Anybody remember, they want to talk about a 6 on the AP test. Anybody remember the university where this first started at? Yale. Okay, so it comes out of Yale University and it spreads. Again, that's trite and trivial, so if you don't remember that, not a big deal. Economics of the Gilded Age can perhaps all fall under this umbrella. Yes, sir?
What does that word say in the top left? It looks like AM.
Here?
Yeah.
Before Americans were farmers. My cute abbreviation. Okay, we might only have time for one more chapter because I want to briefly explain what you got to extract from 26. If I don't get to 27 tonight, I'll start it next week, no big deal. But I certainly do want to get to 25 and finish it because this is the social characteristics of the Gilded Age. So I want to complete the Gilded Age triumvirate. Spell age, Tim. Very good. Okay. Willie Rosender, would you be so kind as to read the summary on chapter 25, please? 2-5.
The United States moved from its country to the city in post-Civil War decades. Mushrooming urban development was exciting, but also created severe social problems, including overcrowding and slums. Attempting to remedy the growing problems of urbanization, such as the city's beautiful movement, were undertaken by people like Dred Scott and Mayo Burnham. After the 1800s, the cities were flooded with new immigrants from southern and eastern Europe. With their strange customs and non-Protestant religions, the newcomers sometimes met with nativists and hostility and discrimination. Religion had to adjust to social and cultural changes. Roman Catholicism and Judaism gained strength, while conflicts over evolution and biblical interpretation divided Protestant churches. American education expanded rapidly, especially at the secondary and graduate levels. Blacks and immigrants tried with limited success to use education as a path toward upward mobility. Significant conflicts over moral values, especially relating to sexuality and role of women, began to appear. The new urban environment provided expanded opportunities for women, but also created difficulties for the family. Families grew more isolated from society, the divorce rate rose, and the average family size shrank.
You can stop there. That last paragraph is irrelevant to what we need to do. So, we'll start with new immigrants. Old immigrants were Irish and German. Where were these new immigrants from? We're good, like Italy or Greece or Russia, basically Southern and Eastern Europe. Old, just think older in the West. Old immigrants were Western Europe, new immigrants Southern and Eastern Europe. More of them come than old immigrants. So in numbers, more than the Irish and German in the 1840s. And they get even harsher nativist backlash. Proof of this is Ellis Island is actually a Gilded Age invention, as is the Statue of Liberty. More on that in a minute. So you get even harsher nativist backlash with these new immigrants. This is also the chapter where let me be clear. Where did these new immigrants live? Most of them? Well, New York is a lot, but I'm looking for the type of, I asked that question. Tenement. This is the grouping of tenements. And we know a lot about them. About 325 square feet. Very little ventilation, at least to start. Very little restrooms or things of that nature. But that falls under this new immigrant umbrella because cities are expanding so rapidly. So you build cheap housing. We're going to see that again tomorrow when we look at the 50s. It's just in a different manner. Okay? Now, this is also the chapter where social work develops, the actual field of social work. And who is the woman who's pretty much responsible for that?
Adams.
Jane Addams. Please spell her name with 2 D's. She is not related to the John Abigail or John Quincy Adams. And the name of her settlement house, and that's what she's known for, the settlement house movement. It was Hull House, very good. Which was in Chicago. Let's ask ourselves why. Why was the settlement house movement needed at this time?
It was like to teach the poor immigrants how to be an American.
That's right. How much help are these new immigrants getting from the government at that time? Zero. So Jane Addams takes advantage, in a way, and she does it in a very noble way, to provide whatever is needed, basically what I'll call assimilation. Now what is that? That's basically a blending into American culture. For these new immigrants. And settlement houses would be copied in every major city in the country after Jane Addams develops Hull House. They also become places for reform. kind of reforms does Jane Addams get involved in? What's one thing? Go for it, Kira.
Labor.
Yeah, labor, both for women in factories as well as child labor. She would be one of the first board members of the National Child Labor Commission in the Progressive era. More on that when we get to chapter 28. Okay? What else does she get involved in? Basically anything that has to do with working conditions or lives of immigrants. She gets involved in housing reform, trying to improve tenements. Okay, this is kind of a catch-all chapter for the changing of America at the time. Here's another thing that we got to talk about. Okay, see if these names ring a bell. Booker T. Washington and Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Both are fighting for what, or for what group of people?
African American.
African Americans. Are both of them African Americans themselves?
Yes.
Yes, they are. One of them is a Southerner, one of them is a Northerner, and that makes a difference. Which one is the Southerner?
Washington.
Booker T. He's from Alabama, which means, how does he feel about total equality if he is living in Alabama in the Gilded Age?
It's not possible.
Not possible. So he founds a university called Tuskegee Institute, still there. And his goal at this university is to do what? It's to get African Americans out of what? Sharecropping. He's going to teach them a trade. These trades include teaching, bricklaying, include peanut farming, include carpentry, include blacksmith. Anything that's going to be better than sharecropping. But he thinks that equality is not possible. He says no to total equality. Here's why he says that. If he would have called for total equality as an African American in Alabama during the Gilded Age, what might have happened to the man? He might have been killed. He might have been lynched. Dr. W.B. Du Bois is no fan of Booker T. Washington. He doesn't like him at all. He founds what's called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Don't really care if you remember the acronym. If you do, great. If not, what's his feeling on total equality? Immediate. He's calling for immediate equality. But he lives in Massachusetts. What university is his doctorate from? Harvard. Yep. So he sees a totally different product than Booker T does. Okay? The other thing in this chapter that we need to at least mention, which is the WCTU and NAUSA. WCTU, well, I'll ask you, what is it and what do they want? Women's Christian Temperance Union, and therefore what do they want? Prohibition. They'll get it, but not in the Gilded Age. These two are the most attended women's groups in the country at the time. It's a social thing. Middle and upper class women are attendees to both of these groups, and this one is calling for prohibition. The leader of the WCTU is Frances Willard, but she's not the most famous member of the WCTU. Who's the most famous member?
Carrie A. Nation.
Carrie A. Nation, who hacks up bars. NAUSA, the National and American Women's Suffrage Association. Pretty obvious from their name. What do they want?
Suffrage.
Universal suffrage. They want the votes for women everywhere. And their leader, and this is a name you probably should know, is Carrie Chapman Catt. Why? Because she changes the game when it comes to why women should have suffrage. It's genius. What does she do?
She brings back like cult of domesticity, and she says, if you give us the voting rights, we'll be better people at home.
Wives and mothers, weaving in that cult of domesticity, where the wealthy elites can perhaps get behind this now. Maybe suffrage is not such a radical idea. Okay. Two more things I want to mention. I want to back up from chapter 24 briefly. I'm going to write the Gibson girl on the board. The Gibson girl, first of all, was she real?
No.
She's the drawings. of Charles Dana Gibson. What is she like? Like, describe the drawings of the Gibson girl. What is she like? Does she live in the country or the city? Oh, go for it, Liliana.
I was just gonna say like athletic.
Yep. Young, pretty, athletic. Does she live in the city or does she live in the country? City. She's the new model American woman. She is the complexity point for what girl that we're going to see 25 years later?
Rosie the Riveter.
Flapper, right? Okay. And then could you use Rosie 20 years after that, perhaps? Maybe, if the Gibson girl started, maybe work it out a little bit. No, I'm kidding. So the other thing I want to mention is the other thing I want to mention is the New South. This is something that gets called for during the Gilded Age, saying the South should industrialize just like the North. Does this happen? Does the South industrialize just like the North?
No.
To a very minor extent. Are there places you could point to in the South that try and industrialize? Birmingham, Charlotte, Atlanta to a lesser extent. But the majority of the South will stay agricultural. Okay? Here's what you got to know about 26. We're going to do this without the summary. The Turner thesis said the frontier was what? Closed. Did that scare Americans when it originally came out? Big time. Why did the buffalo end up going extinct? First of all, why did the buffalo go extinct? Go for it, Daniel.
Overhunted.
Yeah, overhunted. The buffalo was the #1 source of protein for what group of people on the western frontier? Native Americans. Did the average white American care that the buffalo went extinct? No. Okay? The cattle drive. This is the height of the cowboys. What was this? It's taking cattle from Texas and herding them, moving them for 25 years to the Transcontinental Railroad lines in Kansas. Anybody remember what's going to kill the cattle drive? It's a new Gilded Age invention that kills it. The cattle run into something. Good. Who said that? Lorelei Robertson from the corner for 3, and it's good swish. This is killed by barbed wire. We've been on that group. I've been impressed with this group. After the Civil War, all of these army men needed something to do. So they go west to remove the Indians in what simply becomes known as the Indian Wars. This will end abruptly at the Battle of Wounded Knee. After this battle, which is in modern-day South Dakota in 1890, where are all Native Americans removed to? No, we take over Oklahoma. They're moved to reservations. Good news on the reservation system. If you farmed for 25 years, you could become an American citizen. Did Native Americans want to move to the reservation system?
No.
Did they want to become farmers?
No.
Is this sort of the capstone of what started in 1607 of the United States taking away Native American land? It really is. Now, the reservation system has changed a little bit in the last 130 years, but it's still around, unfortunately, in a lot of areas. Great job tonight. This was A+. I applaud all of you for your time. I applaud all of you for your interest and participation. Well done. Sabrina.